So as Lila said, India Center is an incubator of ideas, education, knowledge, and enterprise. And this is a critical moment, right? When we look at American foreign policy, India-US strategic partnership, and the secular rise of this partnership in the last 30 years as the world's strongest democracy and the world's largest democracy coming together and having a global impact. I think 5 different administrations, and Lindsey will attest to it, in different strategic documents have talked about the India-US partnership as the defining partnership for the US in the world. But we still stand at a very critical juncture in this partnership. And I was just quote Lindsey from comments to The Economist, there is definitely a strain in this relationship. Whether that strain is just a seasonal flu or a long COVID, Lindsey will explain that. And we could not have a better person to do this. Lindsey has decades of experience in the US government, but I should underline this, that as Assistant Secretary of State from 2000, Assistant Undersecretary of Defense in Pentagon from 2021 to 2024, and then Special Assistant to President Biden in South Asia, she was in some sense one of the main players or architects in some of the most defining moments in India-US strategic partnership. I think of India-US strategic relationship as in a sense that without US unipolarity and without US strategic altruism, India's rise would have been very difficult in the post-Cold War era. And the real meat to that relationship had just started coming in some sense, right? With very strong material agreements being signed, particularly with President Biden. The initiative on critical emerging technologies being one, which Lindsey was involved in. So I think her contributions are not the ringside view, but right in the ring view of India-US strategic partnership and where we are heading would be very educative for all of us and would give us a lot of thought to think about the strategic partnership, but also think about global politics in general. With that, I will hand it over to Lindsey Ford. Thank you, Lindsey, once again. Really appreciate it.
Great, thank you, Yogesh. And thank you to Global Perspectives and the India Center for hosting me. On March 19th, 2021, I arrived in India with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin on his first official visit to the country. After 2 days of fruitful conversation, I left energized and excited about the work we had ahead of us. But what we didn't know at the time was that India was in the early days of a devastating COVID wave that would soon grip the entire country. And just a week or so after I returned from India, my team was tasked to help coordinate U.S. assistance operations in order to send much needed medical supplies and other relief materials. We worked around the clock with other government colleagues to source medical equipment from around the country. And over 6 days at the end of April, the U.S. military delivered 6 massive plane loads of supplies to India. Millions of tests, masks, other protective equipment, and thousands of doses of antiviral medicine and oxygen cylinders. It would turn out to be the largest and the fastest humanitarian airlift conducted by the U.S. military during the pandemic. It was also an opportunity to pay forward the help that India had given to the U.S. early on in the COVID pandemic. And as the Secretary of State said at the time, in the early days of COVID, India was there for us, and now we want to make sure we're there for India as well. This crisis was my first opportunity to experience firsthand how special the relationship is between the United States and India. There aren't any 2 other countries in the world who both experienced losses at the scale that our two countries did during COVID, but also still had the ability to marshal assistance not just for each other, but for the rest of the world. In many ways, our partnership is so special because we see something kind of familiar in each other. A nation that values its independence because you had to struggle really mightily to achieve it. A state that sometimes struggles to weave together multiple cultural and ethnic groups, and people who are hungry and even impatient for innovation and progress. But there's also something very unique about this relationship. Our shared ability as the world's two largest democracies to shape a global order that's more free, more open, and more just. American leaders have long thought that our friendship with India was one that had global significance. At the inaugural U.S. India conference in 1959, then Senator John F. Kennedy said that building a stronger relationship with India was necessary to expand the arc of democracy in Asia. And in the contest between authoritarians and democracies in Asia, Kennedy argued, we want India to win the race. India, too, has long recognized that our partnership was one that had unique value. On his first official visit to the United States in 1951, Nehru would remark, the United States has always attracted us because of her great qualities of freedom and opportunity and the amazing progress she has made. And so because this partnership is unique, it's one to which we've attached the highest ambitions over the years. Prime Minister Modi, for his part, stated in 2023 that even the sky is not the limit for the United States and India. So how is it then that despite decades of lofty ambitions, we now find ourselves in the midst of yet another sort of crisis in the U.S.-India relationship? In fact, it seems like over the past couple of decades, we've fairly regularly had a series of remarkable highs and challenging lows in this partnership. In the 1990s, the U.S. and India had a rocky period where the United States imposed sanctions on India's nuclear and missile programs. But by the beginning of the next decade, Bill Clinton became the first U.S. president to make an official visit to India in 22 years. In 2001, India was deeply disappointed by what it perceived as a lackluster U.S. response to a terrorist attack on the Indian parliament. But once again, just a few years later, the U.S.-India relationship reached new heights when the two sides announced a landmark civil nuclear agreement. From 2010 to 2020, the U.S.-India partnership exploded with new foundational defense agreements, the Quad began to achieve liftoff, and Prime Minister Modi exchanged multiple historic visits with both President Obama and President Trump. But during this same time frame, the United States and India imposed new steel and aluminum tariffs on each other, and both sides expressed frustration over new immigration and citizenship rules that the other had deployed. Despite the ups and downs, the overall direction of travel for the U.S.-India partnership has been positive, and we've steadily and consistently built a stronger, more enduring partnership. But I also think that the frequency of unexpected turmoil in this relationship points to some underlying weaknesses that as partners, we ought to address. How do we begin to build a more resilient partnership between our countries? Well, we first need to escape what I have come to call 4 traps that have created turbulence in the U.S.-India relationship. And I want to talk for a minute about these issues, not because I want to dwell on problem spots, but because I think that as the world's 2 largest democracies, we have a special obligation to work toward building a relationship that lives up to its highest ambitions. So the first is what I call the inheritance trap. When you look at the past few decades of the U.S.-India partnership, what becomes pretty clear is that very often the friction in our relationship is the result of legacy partnerships that we haven't yet figured out how to reconcile with a closer U.S.-India relationship. Let's be specific about this. In most cases, as in the current one, the issue in question is our respective relationships with Russia and Pakistan, both of which were born out of the Cold War. I would argue that today the value of the U.S.-India relationship far outweighs the value of our respective relationships with Russia and Pakistan. Strategically, politically, economically, it's not even close. And yet, as our ties with each of these partners have weakened somewhat and their relative importance in the world has declined over the last few years, it's created something of an incentive for these countries to make mischief and create a wedge between the United States and India. And whether that's Pakistan's support for violent extremism or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both countries have engaged in activities that undermine the rules-based order in the world, forcing both the United States and India to reckon with the degree to which we want to maintain close ties to a legacy partner that is now creating problems internationally and doing damage to our partnership. The second issue is what I call the home game trap. The United States and India are two big, boisterous, complex democracies. And that complexity is what makes our countries so special. But it also means that managing domestic politics is hard. And at multiple points in our relationship, those domestic complexities have caused friction in our bilateral relationship. Whether that's immigration policy here in the United States or the Kashmir issue in India. It is normal, even natural, for domestic politics to sometimes create tensions between democratic partners. But for the US and India, our domestic politics are inherently intertwined. Indian students comprise nearly 30% of all foreign students studying in the United States. And Indian American population now exceeds 5 million people. Both of those numbers have grown tremendously in the past 20 years. So when the US government tolerates discrimination, or allows Asian American violence, or when it places restrictions on the ability of foreign students to stay and work in the United States, those issues can feel personal in India. And in the same way, reports of violence in Kashmir or restrictions on Indian journalists can be issues of concern to some Indian American communities here in the United States. Our people-to-people ties have been the backbone of this relationship for decades, and I would argue they are the most important element of what makes our partnership special and unique. But if we don't have strong channels of communication, official and unofficial, and a way to talk about sensitive issues, like immigration, like human rights, even religion, we often find ourselves kind of struggling to understand each other's choices. The third issue is what I would call the misalignment trap. India has a long, proud history of non-alignment. The US, interestingly, also had a history of non-alignment for quite a time. But since World War II, our closest relationships have been with a series of countries in Europe and Asia with whom we have special treaty commitments. Because we have a different history of how we think about alliances, as we have built what we consider to be an immensely special partnership, we have sometimes had mismatched expectations of what the terms of that relationship ought to be. India is very reluctant to be pulled into any binding obligations that could reduce its strategic decision space. But it nonetheless hopes to enjoy close collaboration on sensitive issues like military affairs or technology sharing. The United States, by contrast, has typically only shared sensitive technologies or military insights with allies, because it knows those countries will prioritize their relationship with the United States over other ones and will align with the United States diplomatically and militarily. So it creates something of a mismatch in our understanding of what the implied contract is between our two countries. For India, whether it can trust the United States to treat it on par at a level that it thinks that it should be treated as a close partner. For the United States, whether we can share our closest secrets and technologies if a country doesn't want to make a more fundamental commitment to the strategic nature of our partnership. Which brings me to the final trap, the autonomy trap. As two large democracies, India and the United States have a tendency, both of us, to overestimate the degree to which we can go it alone. We both see ourselves as global leaders and as exceptional powers, but we're also both facing economic challenges at home and security challenges abroad that can't be unilaterally overcome. And if India wants to maintain the high pace of economic growth it has enjoyed for the last decade, equally important if it wants to move up the value chain in global manufacturing, it's going to have to lower trade and non-tariff barriers to better integrate the Indian economy with the rest of the world. Similarly, in order to move more quickly in emerging sectors like semiconductor technologies or quantum computing, where China has advantages in research and development, India will need a close partnership with the US tech community. For the United States, it's very hard to see how we continue to access the engineering talent that our technology companies require, or where we find large-scale alternatives to Chinese manufacturing, absent a closer partnership with India. So that brings me to my final question: where do we go from here? In order to build a relationship that is less mercurial, more enduring, the United States and India need to reach a common understanding on three questions. First, we have to accept the necessity of mutual interdependence. Both Washington and Delhi need to acknowledge that the risks we face from a more interdependent, but also more economically and geopolitically powerful partnership are far less than the risks that we face from a weaker, less capable partnership in which we believe that we each maintain complete autonomy. The longer we ignore that reality, the greater the risk is that collectively, the two of us will cede leadership of the global economy and geopolitical leadership of the Indo-Pacific region to China. We simply cannot deliver the growth, the technologies, the military capabilities we need on the timelines that we need them, which is important. We may be able to do certain things on our own over decades, but we don't have decades to produce some of this growth, unless we find a way to work together. And that may sound like a simple statement, but frankly, being politically honest about that fact would drive us to make different policy choices than we have often made over the last decade. The first step in that equation is obviously to complete negotiations on a U.S. India trade deal. Regardless of what you may think about how we have wound up where we have on trade, it's obviously not sustainable for the United States to continue putting 50% tariffs on all of its imports from India. And when one thinks about what a more enduring, resilient partnership would entail, it's reasonable for US companies to want a more open investment environment than what they've faced so far. But beyond trade, we also have to think about how we collectively share and develop the technologies of the future. For the United States, we need to do more to evaluate our export control and technology release policies to find a way to put India on a more equal footing with other close allies and partners. And India, in turn, will need to more radically acknowledge that if it wants to gain access to sensitive technologies, it may have to make more deliberate choices to forego certain types of cooperation with some countries. We're also going to have to be more intentional about aligning our export control and technology policies to minimize the potential for these capabilities to leak to countries who we might not want to have them, so that we continue to protect the intellectual property of our own entrepreneurs and researchers. These are difficult, uncomfortable conversations. But again, I think the risks of interdependence are far less than the risk of maintaining a false sense of autonomy that actually allows us to fall behind. Second, we have to develop a sense of shared parameters for legacy partnerships that we each have. India's partnership with Russia, the US partnership with Pakistan have been on something of a managed trajectory over the last several years. But what we're seeing now is that friction over our respective partnerships has moved those countries back to the center of what we are focused on and talking about a lot of the time. And that is a precarious place for us to be as partners. Neither the United States or India is going to entirely walk away from legacy relationships. They are going to continue to ebb and flow, but we've got to do so in a way that doesn't undermine our own relationship. And I think that is going to require two fundamental constraints. First, we have to acknowledge that we can't force a zero-sum choice on the other partner. There are going to be things in these relationships that will persist. At times, that means the other country is going to do things, whether that is a diplomatic visit, a military training exercise that we don't like. But we can't demarche or sanction each other every single time that that happens. And we can't afford to take our attention off of far more important priorities because we're focused on all of these individual instances of grievances that we have with each other. At the same time, I think we both have to become more accepting of the fact that we need to put in place shared red lines when it comes to these legacy relationships. Whether that's weapons sales, sharing certain intelligence, technology cooperation, we need to be measured and consistent about where to draw those lines, and we need to candidly discuss them with each other as friends. Especially in a world where Russia and Pakistan have integrated their militaries with China and their economies much more closely, as well as to each other. There is no longer a cost-free partnership for the United States and India with these two countries, and our ability to create a wedge that divorces either of them from their reliance on China has grown much smaller. So I think we need to think about deliberate but intentional path to right-size each of our relationships, something of a managed decline, if you will. That's an uncomfortable reality, but if we think the US relationship with India is our priority partnership over the next several decades, and I do, then we're going to have to be willing, each of us, to limit and forego certain types of cooperation that no longer serve that interest. And finally, the U.S. and India have to better ground our partnership in shared values and not just shared interests. There is unfortunately a gap in the U.S.-India relationship between our public rhetoric, which is extremely focused on the democratic nature of our partnership, and our private cooperation, which frankly is far more rooted in hard-nosed geopolitics. It's not to say that we shouldn't remain grounded in our shared interests in countering geopolitical challenges, but we can't afford to have values-related questions pushed to the side, because our inability to explain how our values inform the policy choices we are making in this partnership, and to talk about those choices and where they may differ as partners and as equals, it makes our relationship more brittle. And for the past several years, we haven't done a whole lot of that. Admittedly, I think Indian counterparts have been reluctant to engage in these conversations because of a feeling, and it is not always unjustified, that when the US wants to talk about democracy, we show up looking to take the speck out of our neighbor's eye before we take the log out of our own. And there is probably a frustration as well that US conversations about values or about democracy sometimes preference our own model and things in a way that might not feel like the right fit for India. Those are all legitimate concerns to talk about. But if we lack official and unofficial conversations and dialogues and debates about how our two countries realize and pursue our democratic values, even where they differ, it erodes support for this relationship with portions of the public in both India and the United States. Think about this. In 2008, the annual Pew poll reported only 14% of the American public had a negative impression of India. Extremely positive numbers. By 2023, that number was 44% of the American public that had a negative perception of India. Similarly, the 2017 Pew survey during President Trump's first term showed that only 40% of Indian respondents expressed confidence in the United States to do the right thing in world affairs. Now, in the most recent 2023 poll, that number went up, but that survey also said that 2/3 of Indians believe the United States interferes in the affairs of other countries. These are worrying numbers. They should concern us. They reflect a broader-based lack of trust and understanding about each other's policy choices, and we ignore this at our own peril. It creates a drag domestically when we try to gain legislative support for new bilateral priorities, and it hinders our ability to explain to the rest of the world, including in the global south, what makes the democratic model preferable. To correct this, we're going to have to be willing to sit down together, and academia and civil society play a very important role here, and talk honestly about how we practice democracy at home and what we need to do individually and collectively to ensure our actions live up to our words. In my time in government, I developed close relationships with my Indian counterparts. Friendships that were almost familial in our ability to talk all the time, very candidly, even bicker when we disagreed, and yet we still came back together at the end of the day. And the fact that we enjoyed that kind of relationship reflected a trust that was earned over many months and years of hard work. So I offer my remarks today from the perspective of a great supporter of this partnership, who believes we have a lot of work ahead of us to rebuild some of that trust, but I still don't doubt that we will do so. Because I think, as I said at the beginning, that the United States and India need each other. We are intertwined in a way that would be immensely costly to walk away from. And I remain deeply hopeful for the future of our partnership. But I also hope, as we pass the baton to another generation of young change makers, some of whom may be here today, who will govern the future of this relationship, that we and they will take an honest look at some of the warts and flaws, and that they will help us build a friendship that truly reaches the ambitions that we have set out for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsey, for that very comprehensive view on India-US relations. I would now invite you for a panel discussion, which I will moderate. We'll just open it up to the audience, but just to lead the discussion. I have one specific question because this, in some sense, has rattled India and US relationship right now, and that was a decision which was made during the Biden administration. Was regarding Russian war, right, after the war. And when we contrast it between the Biden administration and the current administration, it seems the Biden administration made a deliberate choice to not publicly raise this issue. I was following everything at that point in time regarding India, what was coming out of the administration, and the administration was very restrained. What was the logic behind that? And how does it contrast to today in terms of U.S. national interest and U.S. foreign policy?
Sure, no, it's a great question. So I would first say before kind of diving down into the oil piece specifically, look, the United States and India had a lot of very frank conversations about things that we didn't agree on when I was in government. And you can imagine with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was a lot of candid conversation about how we each kind of looked at that issue. I will say that to the utmost of our ability, we tried to have those conversations privately, which is something that I still respect because I think these are really difficult issues to navigate. And partners are always better off when you can be as frank and honest with each other as you need to be about how you both feel about certain issues. On Russian oil specifically, there was a slightly different approach in the Biden administration, and I mean, let me be clear, we didn't like the fact that India was, exponentially increasing its purchases of Russian oil, but I think that there were a couple of concerns that we had. One, at the time, global oil supplies were frankly a lot tighter than they are right now. Supply was very limited, and so there was a real concern that actually, if suddenly, given the volume of India's energy supply needs, that it moved away, we could actually see global energy markets really destabilized because of that. And so while we didn't want countries buying Russian oil, I think that the aim of our policy was very much in trying to put a price cap and limit basically what Moscow was making off of its energy purchases. And so that was sort of the emphasis for us, was focusing more on how we brought the overall revenue down for them, and that we did that in a way that sort of didn't destabilize the global economy, frankly, as we were doing it. Now, fast forward today, hey, it's a different world, and energy markets are frankly not what they were before. Would even a Democratic administration make a different choice today about how it approached purchases of Russian oil? Maybe. They might. I would like to think we would not have gone about it in the way that it's being done. But I think from the US perspective, the strategic aim was always to try to bring a peace in Ukraine and to limit the amount of money that Russia could put toward the war. And we had a different approach in how we did that.
So the second issue which I want to raise is you talked about that inheritance trap, right? And I think it's a great way to frame. Many academics in this space, right, should take those four traps and think about how conceptually to organize their arguments. But I also feel that there's another angle to the inheritance trap, which is that both Russia and Pakistan, which you touched upon, use these inheritance traps to create a wedge. But also that in the current scenario, both India and US in some sense are bargaining with each other using these legacy relationships. Is there a bargaining angle to what Russia is trying to do with India and what US is trying to do with Pakistan? That they are not bargaining with one another, but they are bargaining through building the relationships with Russia and Pakistan.
Yeah, so, I mean, the gamble that both countries are making here. Like, there has been legacy reasons why the United States has had a relationship with Pakistan. Even after the Cold War, right, there were a lot of US concerns about extremism coming out of the Middle East or South Asia and needing to work with Pakistan on, you know, putting a lid on the ability of Pakistani extremism to come to the United States or elsewhere in the world. I think more recently, there's been basically a gamble that some in the United States would argue, well, if we have something of a relationship with Pakistan, it limits Pakistan's ability to have a close relationship with China. My own perspective is that our ability to actually influence that is quite narrow at this point. And I think India is making a similar calculus when it comes to Russia. Like, we don't want Russia and China to be too close, so maybe if we, India, have a relationship with Russia, that keeps them from being close to China. I just think we are both currently vastly overestimating the ability that we each have to run that wedge play. And my concern is that actually the wedge play that is being run is against us far more effectively than we are running one against them.
Absolutely. If intentions could be outcomes, we would be living in heaven, right? But with that, I will open this conversation to our participants. Just a couple of things. Please raise your hand. I'll come to you as I see you. But also keep these questions very specific. Thank you so much. Sir, please.
Yes, how do you see the future of India as a BRICS nation, including its relationship with the U.S.? And also, how much do you see the party in the White House as affecting our relationship with India?
So when it comes to the BRICS, I think India actually has an enormous amount of influence over where the BRICS goes. And in some ways, I mean, if you ask me if I want to prefer a BRICS with or without India, in some ways I kind of prefer that India's in there because I'd much rather that India has an ability to keep that group from going in a far more problematic, very anti-American direction than I think India would prefer for it to go. Now, if you gave me the choice, like would I rather that the BRICS maybe wasn't around and talking about things like de-dollarization and stuff like that, sure, I might choose that, but that's not the world I live in. So if it's there on balance, I actually think the US probably is better off having India inside versus outside, because I think India will not allow that group to go in as problematic a direction as it otherwise would if China and Russia could just kind of do what they wanted. The occupant of the White House always has a tremendous influence on the U.S. India relationship, any relationship. I think that in the first Trump administration, the two leaders had a very positive friendship. And I think having that kind of friendship is immensely important to overcome and make progress on a lot of hard things, including things like the trade deal that they're trying to conclude right now. So it's good that the two leaders have engaged each other on social media. I think there's probably still a lot of work to be done, and I hope that they can repair that relationship.
Hey, I have a couple of questions. So in your talk you mentioned if India wants to improve its semiconductor research, they have to stop trading or like reduce their trade with Russia and start trading with the rest of the world. So we know China trades with the whole world and like including US, like last year like US and China traded for like $650 billion. But still, after all this, the US government pressured ASML, a company in Netherlands, to not sell their EUV and DUV lithography tools to China so that they won't proceed with their research. Like, how do you see that? And another question I have is, you mentioned like 2/3 of the Indian population thinks the U.S. government is interfering with the foreign policies, and you said it's concerning, but you also say like the U.S. wanted to have a cap on how much India or any other country could trade with Russia. So how do you say that?
Sure. So on semiconductors, I think India has aspirations to have a large domestic semiconductor industry. Personally, given the volume of chips that the United States and other countries need to buy, I wholeheartedly support India developing a more robust domestic semiconductor industry, because I would like us to have a lot of alternatives for supply. To get there, though, India has incredible design talent, best in the world. Manufacturing, though, is highly expensive, and the ability to do that quickly is, quite frankly, going to require technology cooperation between the United States and India. So we announced a couple of years ago that India was standing up its first national security-focused chip fab. They will build, and they have phenomenal ability to build chips that are highly applicable and of great interest for the US military. But frankly, doing that on their own will take an enormous amount of money and a long amount of time, versus they have been working with the US Space Force and the US military to basically have the United States make a tech transfer that will give them access to some things that let them do that a whole lot faster. I think that is in our mutual benefit. But I think neither one of us is going to really get what we want there unless we sort of work together. On the question about oil caps and interfering in other countries' domestic affairs, I think of these, quite frankly, as different issues. I think how we price global oil is sort of an international issue that all countries wrangle with, whether that's the United States or OPEC. There's a whole lot of countries involved, and it's to me a global issue. I think that's quite different from basically telling you at home how you need to do your business with your own people. And I'm not saying that the United States has not done that at times, because we have. So I'm not even saying that I think it's completely unfair that India at times feels frustrated on that issue. I suspect that, some of the current churn in the U.S.-India relationship on that issue is actually over what happened in Bangladesh last year. I think we just probably have different opinions on what went wrong there. So it is, I think, not completely unexpected that there are countries that feel like the United States has monkeyed around in other countries' internal affairs. I think that's something that probably as the United States we need to look at what we have done at times there, but I don't know that the oil cap issue is probably the right analogy. I think maybe something like, should we have invaded Iraq, is like a better sort of question to be asking.
Is there a question there?
So my question is that the relationships we talk at the geopolitical level, but what do you think about the public perception of the citizens among each other? Because now if we see online, now things have become very much volatile than before. Like you said, in 23, 44% of Americans had a negative perception of Indians. So how do you think, what would be the trajectory of the public perception both citizens have for each other, that?
So, I'll be honest, I was actually kind of surprised when I read the Pew numbers. I went and looked them up, and it actually wasn't what I was expecting. So, I think that overall, ties between, at the people-to-people level, ties between India and the United States are very positive. I even think, frankly, in the US Congress, overall perceptions of India are very positive, and that's on a bipartisan basis. But as I said in my talk, I think that there are things that, frankly, each of us read in our media. Like, if I go and read Indian newspapers, which I do, The United States absolutely fomented a coup in Bangladesh. We are trying to weaken India through our relationship with Pakistan. The black hand of the United States is behind various things. I mean, I read this stuff all the time. It's all over the Indian media. Now, the flip side of that is a lot of times in American media, I frankly think that a lot of stuff that I read about India is pretty narrow. I read about Kashmir all the time. I rarely read U.S. papers like the Times and the Post writing about other things that are going on in India, right? So I think we have a problem where, quite frankly, it's not about the people-to-people level. That's really good. I think sometimes the way that, like, in our public media sphere, we talk about each other's countries is kind of a narrow slice of what's going on. And I think we deserve creating a much richer and wider and more nuanced understanding of the United States in India and of India in the United States than probably what we presently have.
I would call that the inertia of past perceptions, right, which continue to inform our contemporary understanding of both countries in some sense. But yeah.
All right, thank you.
Just that person, and then we'll come to you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I want to ask, does the alignment between U.S. and India, geared towards balancing China? And secondly, is India engaging in non-aligned ideology? So I want to understand.
Sure, good questions. India certainly has, as I was saying, a strong history of non-alignment. What I think is interesting right now is when you look at people like, External Affairs Secretary, Dr. Jaishankar, he talks about multi-alignment now versus non-alignment. And I think that's really interesting because what that means is, no, India doesn't want to have fixed treaty alliances, but at the same time, we kind of recognize that we got to have close partners who we can work with. And so I do think the way that India practices non-alignment has actually evolved. And that's an important thing to recognize, I think.
Yeah, hi, I'm Benias. I'm from India. So I don't want to land myself into the political crossroad. It's not a suitable forum for me. But I understand that both US and India, they are peace-loving countries. They want to establish a good ties with their neighboring countries. That's what it is. And so far, when we say about the political hike in tariffs and all, one thing that matters to us is the exchange of students. Okay. So I understand that President Trump wants to fulfill one of his political promise, that is to create employment, and I welcome his decision. But how it is now, the restrictions on Indian students or Indian citizens who are coming here on a work visa or exchange student, putting a cap on this, how it is going to affect this relationship?
I think it makes our relationship weaker in the long run, is the short answer. So specifically, there's consideration in Congress right now of changing the rules for a visa category that's called OPT, which basically means that students come study in the United States and they have a certain amount of time basically after they finish that they get to still stay and work in the United States. My own argument would be the U.S. has benefited tremendously over the last few decades from Indian students staying and working in the United States, and oftentimes staying forever, even becoming citizens. I think you can look across numerous sectors, but certainly technology is an obvious one. And there are prominent Indian Americans who have contributed their entrepreneurial skills to the United States, and we've benefited tremendously from that. So to me, in the long run, you know, it makes us weaker to not still have that pipeline, and it worries me that you're going to see a lot of that really strong, you know, engineering talent that people are going to decide, well, maybe I want to study in the UK or Canada or Australia, because maybe that's on balance, like feels less risky for me right now. I think that would be a huge loss for us.
Hi. Do you see some things like the ICET, like the India's initiative on critical and emerging technologies on the green supply chain, which is kind of a credit to you and your work? Would they be the casualties out of this, or will they survive?
I think that's an open question, if I'm being honest. I was, you know, look, when administrations change, it is not uncommon that, you know, you sort of dump some of the stuff from the old team and you create your new stuff. I was frankly very pleased during Prime Minister Modi's visit in February that most of the stuff that we were doing with India actually was sustained. And you can read the joint statement that the two leaders signed, and really all they did was change the titles of it. I'm actually not joking, it's serious. They just changed the titles of the stuff that we were working on, gave it new titles, and then said all of this is continuing to move forward. From my view, don't care. Call it what you want. The work is important, and I thought there was a really positive recognition in a bipartisan fashion that the work the US and India were doing on innovation and technology was important. Unfortunately, I think a lot of that work has gotten caught up in just sort of the chaos over trade and everything else. I don't think it has to go away, but I don't think there's been a whole lot of momentum behind it in the last few months. And frankly, they've fired most of the people that were running that work at the State Department and the White House, so I'm also sort of not sure who's actually going to be in charge of it at this point. But there's nothing that anyone inherently objects to about those initiatives, so I do have some hope that they will resuscitate them, but it's in a little bit of a state of suspended animation right now.
Any other questions?
I can take one for the team, I guess.
Please, go ahead.
I was curious because of your discussions on China and, you know, popular opinion on the U.S. and how it tends to stake its claim internationally. Historically speaking, you know, China, through its Belt and Road Initiative and BRICS, as we've discussed, tends to spread its reach through economic means. It's now, you know, the leader in renewable energy. It's competing with the U.S. in AI, which the U.S. has inevitably put most of its eggs in that basket. And historically speaking, yeah, like if we're mentioning Iraq, among other countries, the U.S. does typically stake its claim through military means. So do you feel like that challenges bringing something like an India-U.S. economic relationship to the table, considering we aren't in the U.S. economic golden age? And China does seem to be bringing something new and closer in proximity in nature to India, despite, for example, their border disputes.
So just to make sure I understand, the question is basically, do I think that maybe China has more to offer to India, essentially?
Essentially, do you find that the U.S.'s history and the recent Chinese history through spreading economic and less militaristic measures and trading measures, do you think that will inevitably tip them towards China rather than the United States? What does the United States have to offer that China isn't offering, and also within closer proximity to India?
Well, a lot, I think, is the answer. I mean, one thing that I would say I suspect most people in Delhi think is quite different is we don't have a whole lot of US soldiers sitting along a border threatening to invade India. So I think that is like a real and probably the most problematic issue in the India-China relationship that I don't think is going anywhere anytime soon. And the fact that India and China have a contested border, the fact that China is building up all kinds of infrastructure along that border to continue to threaten India, is a reality that's kind of not going anywhere super fast. And when I look at that problem, sort of like, well, the US would help you with that. China would actually just try to see if they could claw back parts of India. It feels like a fundamentally different relationship. So at a very fundamental level, I think that is a stark difference. But aside from that, I mean, I would personally argue that I think that the Chinese economic model is kind of mercantilist. So sure, maybe there's a lot of investment. You open up the floodgates for Chinese investment. I think that's at India's own peril, because I think who benefits more from that is Beijing than Delhi. And I think folks in India know that, which is why they've had pretty strong restrictions.
And do you think the U.S. knows that, and that's why they're on this pressure campaign to change the relationship?
To change the relationship.
Relationship with India.
Um,
Their vulnerability to China, like what power does that give the U.S. over India?
I don't think it's necessary. I don't think about it, and I don't think most U.S. policymakers think about like the motivation for the U.S.-India partnership as like getting sort of power over India. I think they see the relationship with India as providing advantages when you look at maybe how you counter what China is doing in the region, and providing alternatives, really.
Thank you. Because I see this new administration or returning administration as very self-serving, and so I question the ethical legitimacy of their decisions, and like how much pressure they're putting on other countries to kind of satisfy a very money-making type goal over actual relationships.
So I think
Transactional, yes.
Yeah, transactional. Here's the thing. I think, if you talked to a lot of political scientists, they would tell you that, realism and a lot of other theories suggest that all states are fundamentally self-serving, right? What they're going to do is they're going to try to sort of like maximize their own power against everybody else, and I think if you look over history, that has probably been the way that most countries have operated. Now the issue is the United States, when we moved into a position of being the most powerful country in the world, kind of said we do things a different way. And I think that the rest of the world has benefited from that tremendously. I think we've also benefited from that. The problem is we got people pretty used to the fact that in the United States we have a different model of leadership, and we said that's about who we are. And we now have an administration who's like, maybe not. Maybe actually we're just going to be as transactional as everybody else. And I think that is probably a very uncomfortable feeling for a lot of us in the United States who think, is that really who we are? I thought that wasn't who we were. And it's probably very uncomfortable for a whole lot of countries who think, oh, I thought there was a really different model from the United States of doing business. It's not wrong, I think, for a country to question at times whether you need to adjust the way that you're doing things, even the way that you're leading, even the terms of maybe burden sharing with other countries. My personal view is, though, that the model of U.S. leadership that we have employed for the last few 70, 80 years now, has on balance probably given as much or more to the United States as it gave to the rest of the world, has enabled a whole lot of growth and unilateral influence that we've had in the world. And I don't think we should walk away from that quite so easily.
Okay, if there are no other questions, I'll just conclude this panel, but I'll add one more track. And I think there's been a lot of comment on US policy, right? It's also important to shift the gaze to India, right? Because otherwise it's not objective analysis. Delhi should also understand the context of global politics it is in. And that trap, I think, mostly applies to New Delhi. And that is a trap of dealing in tropes. And the three tropes which Delhi has kind of taught as best. The first of those tropes is this idea of non-alignment, right? It's very interesting, and this is a vignette I want to share, that the next day, when India signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union in August 1971, Secretary of State Roger Williams called the Indian ambassador in DC to his office and said, "Oh, we thought you're non-aligned. How did you sign this treaty of friendship with Soviet Union?" And Alke Charima, he said, we never said we are non-aligned when we are facing a threat to our existence, right? So India made choices. India made allies. India was in an alliance relationship. So it's not as if there is a purest form of strategic autonomy which India has practiced and kept distance from everyone. That's a myth. And it's important for academics, for serious thinkers, to think about states' behavior rather than the rhetoric, right? That's the first trope. The second trope regarding India is the trope of states. Diplomacy is fundamentally about power and interests. If you don't have the power and interest, you won't have status. And most importantly, it's the powerful in the system which will recognize your status. India's rise in global politics, it's very interesting, happened in a hegemonic world order. Without the recognition from fellow great powers, no rising power actually becomes a great power, right? So it is important for foreign policy bureaucrats and thinkers in India to understand the importance of power and interest in pursuit of status. And the third thing, which is a trope of multipolarity. By all indicators, academic indicators, the world is in a bipolar world. It is not a multipolar world. China has surpassed the material attributes of all other great powers which have challenged hegemons in the past by any methods. We are not in a multipolar world. Everybody wants to call it a multipolar world because that suits everyone else, right? But more importantly, India has had no experience of living in a multipolar world. And any IR theorist over here will know that multipolarity means something substantively different. And I think it's important for Delhi to also grasp what really multipolarity is. And I think Raja Mohan, one of the greatest strategic thinkers in India, used to say that when India calls about multipolarity, it doesn't call about multipolarity in the world, it calls about multipolarity in Asia, because that's what matters. So I think on both sides, both New Delhi and DC, have to really think hard about this relationship and think about pathways to come out of these traps, which Lindsey so beautifully and comprehensively outlined. But I also believe as a political scientist that, politics blows over a period of time. There are anxieties, there are crises, but crises are not necessarily bad for two reasons. One, it focuses mind. Like anything else, normal politics doesn't focus your mind, right? It focuses your mind on important things. And crises are the moments when real exchange of information on intentions and interests happen between states, not in their rhetoric. So I think it's important to also understand that crises are moments of opportunity. And I hope both in Delhi and in Washington, D.C., these crises would be taken as such. With that, let's give a big round of applause to Lindsey for enlightening us on a very important issue. Thank you, Lindsey. Really.
How are you?